Okay, let's get started. Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Arctic and Alpine Wildflowers of the Northern Hemisphere, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Eleanor Edye. Eleanor, thanks for being here today. We really appreciate it. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Colby, and hi to everybody who is out there. Like Colby mentioned, today we're going to be talking about wildflowers, and I'm so excited to be here talking about this today because they are very near and dear to my heart. So for reference, some of you may have met me in the past, many of you will have not, but I am a Canadian expedition leader, and I live in Manitoba, which is the same province where the town of Churchill is located, which is where we run a lot of our polar bear trips, as well as beluga whales and northern lights expeditions. And Churchill is where I got my own personal start as a biologist. I spent a number of summers there doing graduate research, doing a lot of plant surveys. So in the Arctic and Alpine regions, you spend a lot of time on your hands and knees looking at very, very small wildflowers, and I find these things immensely fascinating. So I'm so glad to be here and have a chance to speak with you all about this today. We will talk about some specific plant species that can be found in both the Alpine and Arctic areas, but I also wanted to take a broader look at the topic and look at some things like some of the similarities between these regions, why we see so much overlap in the floral assemblages, even though these areas can be quite separated geographically, as well as some of these specific adaptations that these plants have to these cold and harsh environments. So to start off with, I wanted to just kind of bring us into where we're going to be talking about, and starting off with the Arctic. If you've ever heard anybody talk about the Arctic before, they've probably stopped to define where exactly they're speaking about, because there are multiple definitions of what the Arctic is. We can talk about the Arctic Circle, which is shown here on the map in a small black line. That's a very normal circle. And that's, of course, located at a specific latitude where everything above that is in the quote unquote Arctic. We can also have more human-related definitions. So some of the, for example, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program will look at different communities, assess them as Arctic, and talk about what kind of sustainable development, pollution control, oil spill monitoring is relevant to those regions and call those the Arctic. But when we're talking about organisms, aside from humans, and specifically looking at plants, we have to look at more of some of the other types of definitions that look at the like the temperatures and other conditions on the ground. So there are a few of the main definitions that we use for when we call something the Arctic if you're a plant. One of those is the line of the permafrost. So if you were to look at this map here, some of the more southern lines here are the ones I'm going to be talking about. So the thin black line that weaves all around is the line of the continuous permafrost. And this means that north of this line, if you were to dig down with a shovel, at some point you would hit permanently frozen ground. And if you step 6 feet over and dug again, you would find more permanently frozen ground. So it's continuous, it's found all underneath the soil, and this has some really big implications on things like how far down tree roots can grow, how cold the soil is, things like that, how many growing degree days a plant gets. We can also look at the 10 °C July isotherm. Big fancy names. It basically just means if any one day in July, the average temperature is only 10 °C, so that's, I think, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, not terribly warm. That is, again, a plant's definition of the Arctic. And that 10 °C July isotherm correlates really well with what I really want to zero in on, which is the tree line. And the tree line, we'll talk more about in just a second about what that actually is. But on this map here, the tree line is shown as a thin green line. And it cuts basically right across Siberia, around North America. It starts off quite far north. If you've been to Alaska, you know that most of Alaska is treed. And then it goes very far south, swings around the bottom side of Hudson Bay, including Churchill. So it's where that tree line is in terms of the latitude differs quite a bit in terms of where you are in that Arctic region. But as the title of this talk suggests, we're going to also talk about alpine environments. And here we're focusing in on the northern alpine environment, so the northern hemisphere. And I just kind of drew a big circle around the areas we're going to be talking about in for the majority of the alpine components here. So really, places like the Rocky Mountains, places like the Alps and some of the Scandinavian high altitude areas as well. I'm not including anything that gets into the lower latitudes because as we get into those tropical mountains, we don't get those really harsh conditions. We get very different things like moisture and sunlights. It's not the same kind of environment where we find those really stunted, hardy plants. So we're focusing on areas like the Rockies, like the Alps, and like those very northern high latitude regions of North America, Greenland, Scandinavia, and Russia. Now, if you've been to any of these areas before, you know that they can be at least very harsh places. We can get extreme low temperatures, and this can be throughout the winter, but also getting into the summer as well. Something that they're very well known for is frosts that can occur even in the summer months. They share extreme temperature fluctuations. So for example, in Churchill, where I've worked a lot, we see temperatures that go down below -45 Celsius or about -50 Fahrenheit regularly in the winter. And then on the flip side, in the summer, we see temperatures well into the 80s Fahrenheit or well into the mid-20s Celsius. So very, very extreme temperature fluctuations going between the summer and the winter. And sometimes because of very abrupt temperature changes, even day to day, you might have a place that's, sitting around your mid-70s that gets a cold front moving in and has abrupt freezing, again, even within those summer months. They're also well known for being places of strong winds, and this is hard if you're a plant because winds promote moisture loss. The growing season is short, so the time when you don't get a frost, the time when frost starts happening again, might be a period of only several weeks, extending up to several months. But we know that it's not a place like where I spend most of my year, in southern Manitoba, where we say that we don't have summer, but we really do. I mean, we have down here, we have our last frost usually in May, we have our first frost usually in September. Even that seems extreme to a lot of people, but it's nothing like what we might see in the high Arctic or at high elevations. And that moisture stress, we know that plants need water. And if you're like me and you've accidentally killed a few houseplants, you know that not giving them water is the easiest way sometimes to accidentally kill your plants at home. Now, these plants that live in these high altitude and high latitude regions, many of them live under extreme moisture stress conditions. So we'll talk a little bit about what they have as adaptations to combat these problems. Now, where I really want to zero in on in terms of the species that we talk about is not the ones that occur, what we say, below the tree line, but those that occur at or above the tree line. And if you've ever visited a mountain area that goes high enough up, you've probably seen the tree line and you can kind of tell me roughly what it is. And this is roughly what it looks like, right? Here we are on a mountainside. Down below, you have a closed forest, meaning that if you were to stand in that forest and look up, most of the branches would be touching. There wouldn't be a lot of open sky. As you move up the mountain, the trees become more and more sparse, and it becomes what we call now an open forest. So if you were to, again, stand within those trees and look up, you would see a fair amount of sky, meaning that there's lots of areas of the ground that don't have trees on them. And at some point, as you move up the mountain, there are simply no more trees. So this transitional area here is what we call the tree line. It's not a hard and fast line. It moves with different conditions, as much as trees can move, and we'll talk about that too. But it's a region. It's not a single line on the ground. On one side, there's definitely trees. On the other side, there's definitely no trees. And everything in between, we call the tree line ecotone, meaning that it is that transitional area. And at the tree line, We have a lot of Arctic plants that, that live there, but we also still have some trees who are trying to make a living there as well. And trees can be very, very heavily modified in terms of their growth form at the tree line because of those same conditions that cause the same stress on those plants. So this, for example, is what we call a flag tree, and I took this picture just outside the town of Churchill in northern Canada. And you can see that because of extreme wind conditions, and those winds in the winter carrying lots of ice particles, that in fact that tree has lost all the branches on one side of its stem. It's also got this tree skirt that we call it around the bottom. So those branches that are still very, very full and occur on both sides of the tree, those would be underneath the snow in the winter. So trees can look very, very bent, twisted, modified at that tree line and within that ecotone. And again, as we move past that ecotone, we get to an area where there are no trees, or at least, in short, sometimes we get trees that aren't actually trees. You might have, for example, a spruce tree or a larch tree that germinates and grows, but it can only grow as a mat. So we call that the tree species line. There's the tree line beyond which you don't get any trees. And then you might still get some sparse individuals who simply are so stressed by all those conditions that they can't actually form an upright growth form. So beyond that point, we call that the tree species line. So a bunch of definitions to throw at you. You can remember them or forget them, but what I wanted to kind of discuss was that real transitional area here, and the fact that where we're talking about and the species that we're going to talk about as we move into those Arctic and alpine environments, these are primarily species that grow where trees can't. It's too rough for trees to grow. It's too stressful. We are talking about those species that are so incredibly hardy and adapted to these conditions that they can grow beyond the point where trees can. And like I said, just to kind of bring you into what this might look like, it might look something like this. So this is some Arctic tundra just to the north of Churchill. So we see very low shrubby plants, no trees to be seen. If you came in the winter, it would be more or less fully covered by snow. Or we might be talking about those high altitude environments that we find in mountains. So on this picture here, and this is a picture from one of our Rocky Mountains trips, you can see on the mountainside how the trees creep up the mountain, and then at some point the trees stop and you get what's called that high elevation, either grassland or pasture or meadows. So the kinds of species that we're talking about are living right on that edge. They're definitely species of the edge. So between those two different environments and those two different locations, these Arctic and alpine regions that we're talking about, how on earth did these species, which in many cases are either the same species or very closely related species, end up so separated geographically? Well, there are multiple reasons, right? Some obvious ones, right? If we have similar conditions, we got cold, we have dry, we have permafrost, we have winds, you would really expect to see, if not the same plant, you would expect to see similar plants in those regions, because what is successful in those conditions will still be successful in those same conditions, even if it's located somewhere else. We have other reasons as well that are due to humans. So things like anthropogenic reasons. In places like the Alps, alpine pastures are maintained not just because of temperature conditions, but also because of human activity like grazing in the area of cattle. That will also suppress the trees and just encourage those low, shrubby things to persist and wildflowers. But primarily, the reason that we see these species separated like this geographically is because of what we see 2 million years ago, so in our historical climate. And as always, usually if you want to figure out why things are how they are right now, you start by looking at what they were a little while ago and see if that can explain it. So if we look back, this is only here about 27,000 years ago. This is during what's called our last glacial maximum. So at this time, we had a cooler environment. Ice was, a lot of ice was found both in continental ice sheets as well as high elevation glaciers. And the Laurentide ice sheet in North America and the Eurasian and Greenland ice sheets elsewhere really took up a lot of the available water and covered a lot of that high latitude land. So if you went to Churchill 27,000 years ago or points further north, you would not be standing on land. You would be standing on several kilometers or even in some cases 1 or 2 miles of ice, right? So there wasn't alpine or Arctic flora there because there was no land for them to grow on. But what this meant was that the areas that we now think of as our alpine areas, so the Rocky Mountains and the Alps, and again, those Scandinavian regions and even the Himalayas, all of those regions were actually directly adjacent to what was then Arctic areas. So if you wanted to go to the Arctic 27,000 years ago, you'd probably go to Minnesota, or you might go to Wisconsin, right? Places where the glaciers have pushed down into, the ice sheets. And because they were so far south, we could have those species moving without any kind of barriers. So the species that existed through the Rocky Mountains, the species that existed through the Alps, were directly connected to the habitats that were in use by Arctic plants at that time. So these are just some of the vegetation types that were present during the last glacial maximum. So again, those ice sheets covered a large part of the northern continents. And really it comes down to 27,000 years ago, it was a lot colder. So the Arctic vegetation is actually still making its way back to the north. All of those cold-loving plants were found at the edge of the ice sheets. And as the ice sheets receded, as things warmed up, those plants did move. And they didn't pick up and move, with feet. But as they produce seeds, the seeds blow into newly exposed areas. If the conditions are right, those seeds grow, and so on and so forth. So just by establishing new populations, those cold-loving species were able to reestablish themselves in those more northern areas after the ice sheets were gone. And they simply just stayed behind in the alpine areas. So those alpine areas that were connected still have the same species, because at one point, and 27,000 years ago was not that long for a species, all of those habitats were connected. So we will be talking about some specific Arctic and alpine areas, and I won't take too long with these graphs at all, but I just wanted to point out that this is a climate graph for the city of Iqaluit. So this is the capital city of Nunavut, which is the Northern Territory directly above the province of Manitoba in Canada. So it is located about 70 degrees north. In Iqaluit, we could consider this to be a low Arctic environment. So it's not a desert. It gets a fair bit of precipitation, but it's cold and it's windy and it gets lots of sun in the summer. So the precipitation is shown here in green, and sorry, I could only get this shown in metric here. 63 millimeters per month is their top amount of precipitation. 63 millimeters is only about 2.5 inches, so it's still a fairly dry area. And these plants that exist here are likely under moisture stress. The frost-free season in Iqaluit is usually about 60 to 70 days. If we were to move into one of our high alpine areas, I've got another climate graph here from Santis, which is at 8,200-foot elevation in the Alps. It's also really cold. It's also really windy. But here we can see something that's typical of some of the alpine environments, is that it is much more wet. So those green bars, again, are still our precipitation. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is that when we're talking such a cold area, a lot of this precipitation falls as snow. Makes sense, right? And snow is not accessible to a plant. So if you're a plant trying to grow on a mountainside and most of the precipitation, firstly, falls as snow, you can't use that. Secondly, it's falling on a mountainside, and if it falls as rain, it's running right down. Still not terribly usable to a plant because it's not being held in the soils. These are still going to be organisms that are under a fair bit of moisture stress. So our climate graphs can look pretty similar in terms of the temperature itself and the winds. And one thing I want you to keep in mind is that even as we're seeing tremendous differences in terms of the precipitation, that for a plant who's living on the ground in a rock crevice, it doesn't actually look that different to them. So, and again, in all of these places that we're talking about, I talked about that permafrost before. Churchill, Iqaluit, the Alps, I put stars on each of those. These are all areas that are within the continuous permafrost area. So these are spaces where even if water does manage to penetrate the soil, that's frozen ground, which again, anything frozen is unavailable to a plant in terms of its own moisture needs. So thanks for bearing with some of that background science about why those plants are there and why they are living in such similar condition. But let's start looking at some of those specific plants. And the one that I want to start looking at is, arguably the most extreme of all the plants we're going to talk about, at least of the vascular plants. I'm not talking about mosses and lichens today. Near and dear to my heart though they are, I wanted to focus on the flowers and the flowering plants. So we're going to talk about the one, the most extreme, which we can argue about, like I said, of the vascular flowering plants. So this plant that you can see here is called either purple saxifrage or purple mountain saxifrage, depending where you are. And this is a beautiful picture. I hope you enjoy it. I like to show this one. It shows the floral structure. It shows what the plant looks like. It's a beautiful shot. This is one of the close to 500 species of plants we can find in the Churchill area. In the high Arctic and Alpine areas, this will probably be one of the 200 to 300 species you can find in those areas. Globally, we have about 1,500 flowering plant species in the Arctic and Alpine regions. Obviously, I don't have time to talk about all those today, so I really wanted to focus on what I think are some of the most fun ones, like the purple saxifrage. So keep this beautiful photo in your mind while I switch to our next photo, because this is usually what I see when I go out looking for purple saxifrage. So it's still beautiful, right? It's still an Arctic and Alpine plants. So the purple saxifrage, its scientific name is Saxifraga oppositifolia. And if you look at those, at the leaves on this plant, if you can find them because they're so incredibly small, you can see that it's actually named for these 4 ranked leaves where each leaf is directly opposite another leaf. Now, I didn't put a scale in when I took this image, but if you look at it, you can see the individual grains of sand. This is a plant that I found growing on a sandbar outside the town of Churchill. I got lucky. I was actually there looking. I was there looking for birds, and I got distracted by the fact that the first flower of the year was out, because in most regions where purple saxifrage can be found, it is the first flower that comes out. And if it's not flowering, it is so hard to find. It is so small, and it grows so slowly. So of all those, you can take a look at those leaves, those very, very small leaves. This plant that you're looking at here, that's maybe an inch or 2 across, it's probably at least 20 to 30 years old. Each plant will usually make about 2 leaves every summer. That's it, 2 whole leaves, and it's a success. And that's a good year for one of these plants. So it's always so amazing to me how such a small, really scraggly looking plant can produce such a beautiful flower that if you're not out at the right time of year, you just completely miss the beauty of this plant. Now, this is not the only saxifrage that can be found in Arctic and Alpine areas, but I like this one because to start talking about, because it can be found really all around the Northern Hemisphere in all of these areas. So if you're there, as soon as snowmelt happens, whether it's in an Arctic environment or in an Alpine environment, you're probably going to be able to find this particular species. If you're a gardener, you may have other saxifrages in your garden. The name literally means rock breaker. So some people think it's because it lives on predominantly rocky areas, but it may also be because it was traditionally used as a treatment for kidney stones. So two possibilities there. They're also known as rock foils. So the saxifrages as a whole are about 440 species, many of which are found in those Arctic and alpine areas. Now, this is not a saxifrage here, but I just wanted, because I didn't dig that one up, I would never do that, but I wanted to give you an idea what that plant might look like if you actually were to dig it up, because they never look that impressive from above, right? But they are working so hard to preserve those few leaves that they have left. So all of these cushion forming plants will go on and they will retain as many resources as they can, and they will anchor themselves into those gravel ridges or sandbanks with these really, really thick and deep tap roots. So this plant here, this is actually a moss campion, but the same principle applies with any of these other things like the saxifrages. You're looking at a plant here that is decades old and that has put a lot of resources and a lot of work into creating its own pocket of environment for those extra leaves and flowers to grow in. So back to the purple saxifrage. Now, other things that we know about it, it's been around at least since the last ice age. So it's been around for at least about 30,000 years. It's known as the northernmost wildflower on Earth, as it is found in the northernmost piece of land on Earth. And not only can it survive in the most northern areas, it can survive incredibly extreme conditions, including cold environments, including environments without sunlight for long periods of time, including periods without water, and some very brief growing seasons. So it has been found not only in the most northern piece of land on Earth, but it's also been found as a plant to occur in the highest spots of any plant that's ever been found. So it's been found in a particular mountain range in the Alps where the peaks reach over 4,300 meters, so over 10,000, actually, sorry, over 12,000 feet. And this, it only needs about 600 hours of temperature above 3 degrees Celsius, or about, what would that be, around 40 degrees Fahrenheit per year to survive. How can you even compete with that as a plant? 600 hours above, just above freezing, and it's good to go. It can flower, it can make new leaves. What an incredible species. So just to zoom in and show you those beautiful flowers one more time. So they demonstrate a lot of Arctic and alpine adaptations that I wanted to point out. So the plant itself can work as a greenhouse. So some studies, including studies in Greenland, have shown that inside that cushion of leaves that is underneath the flowers here, you can see that there's still ice, there's still snow on them, but inside that cushion of leaves, you can reach about 38 degrees Fahrenheit, so about 3.5 degrees Celsius, when it is still well below freezing outside that clump. So when it was 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside that clump of leaves, they measured 38 inside the clump. So that's -12 outside and +3.5 inside the clump. That is all that species needs to survive and flower and photosynthesize and make seeds. As long as there is sunlight, those dark colored leaves will capture the sun's energy, and because they are so tightly packed together, including being covered with a number of small hairs, even those high winds cannot break, they can't get through the densely packed leaves and the hairs to remove that extra heat. So it's a way of that plant that it can create its own environment, even when it is surrounded by snow and ice and howling winds and cold. Really just mind-blowing, continuously blows my mind. So a lot of the adaptations that this plant shows are shown in other plants as well, but perhaps in a slightly less extreme way. So for example, it is perennial, meaning it comes back year after year. It has bud readiness, which means that before the snow falls, the saxifrage is actually going to already make its flowers for next year, so that as soon as it gets enough sunlight, the flowers pop out and it doesn't have to wait to do any photosynthesis. It's very low in height, so it's not going to catch a lot of that wind. And it can also capture wind-blown dust and dirt to capture nutrients and start to make soil by having all of those dead leaves compacted in underneath it, as well as having those hairs on the leaves as well. So a lot of those similar adaptations we see in other species too. As a side note, it is an edible plant. Arctic hares love it. You can eat it as a person as well. This is not true of all saxifrages though. So like I said, the purple saxifrage can be found in the circumpolar region, including in high altitude. We see a lot of other saxifrages as well. I won't dwell on these too much, but I wanted to show you some pretty photos. So this is the Saxifraga aphylla, or the leafless saxifrage. This is found specifically in the Alps. They have these solitary flowers, and you can see on the flowers that the petals are incredibly reduced. So they are using all their resources to put into just the necessary growth. They're not making anything showier than it has to be. These are also one of the quote unquote rock breakers. So you see them in rocky debris fields, often on limestone, and they live also at very high altitude for the most part. Not every saxifrage is super tiny. A lot of them are actually a little bit bigger, and some of them are used quite popularly in rock gardens. If you live in a rocky site or in a drier site, saxifrages are a great addition to a garden. This is a three-toothed saxifrage. So you can see, again, as soon as you start seeing plants growing in rock crevices like this, and you see those rosettes of leaves, so all the leaves being compacted in a small bulb like that along the ground, you can say, starting to look like a saxifrage. I wonder what kind it is. So this one we know as a three-toothed because each leaf actually has 3 teeth on it. And the flowers themselves, while not large, I think are they're really beautiful. So this is what the three-toothed saxifrage flower looks like. It's only about ½ an inch across, or about 1 centimeter, but same as is true with many of those Arctic and Alpine wildflowers. The diversity and beauty is incredible, but you do have to get really up close to fully appreciate it because they tend to be very, very small. They're not there for us to see primarily. They're there for their pollinators and not much else. One of the larger saxifrages that we see again in a circumpolar area, so it's found around the northern globe. This is called grass of Parnassus, and it's not a grass, it's not from Parnassus, but it's another saxifrage. Again, you can see it's growing on rocky debris, on gravel, even in rock crevices, and it's got that basal rosette, so it's got those leaves in a little tuft all growing along the ground, and the flower stalk comes up high above that area. Again, it's got those 5 petals, which we saw in all those other saxifrages as well. And in this case, this flower is actually, it's relatively huge. It's probably a full inch across, or maybe about 2.5 centimeters. So these tend to carpet the ground about midsummer. They're fairly showy as Arctic and Alpine wildflowers go. And they're, like I said, one of the bigger flowering members of the saxifrage family. Now, another white flower that you're going to see throughout the Arctic and Alpine areas is this scientific name here is Dryas octopedula, which is known as white mountain avens or mountain dryas or white dryas. It all depends where you are. So it's circumpolar as well as in the mountainous areas. And fossils of these plants have actually been incredibly important in studying historical climate shifts. So if you ever read about the younger Dryas, this was a brief cooling of the earth, and we know that it happened because Dryas moved into areas where it hadn't lived for quite a while. So anytime you see Dryas growing, where you see Arctic avens growing, you know that it's a fairly cold, fairly harsh environment. So even though it's not a saxifrage, look, it doesn't have those 5 petals, but it does still have those basal leaves. So the leaves grow in a small tuft on the ground. You can see that there's a lot of dead leaves in the area as well. So those get retained to help control heat loss, to help bring any nutrients in. They're going to use everything they can. So these are beautiful flowers. Octopedula, you might think, well, it's going to have 8 petals. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it has more. It has some number, usually a lot, of white petals. And these come out after the purple saxifrage, so they're still a fairly early summer plant. And they're really fun because they are heliotropic, meaning that they actually will turn their flowers to follow the sun. And you couldn't find a more perfect parabola to focus the sun's energy directly into the center of the flower. So unlike sunflowers and other species that exhibit heliotropism to actually try to turn away from the sun to keep the flowers cooler so they don't overheat and cook, because these guys are living in a very cold environment, they're doing the opposite. They're maximizing the amount of energy that comes into the plants. And in fact, studies have shown that if you were to, for example, force a plant to be in the shade where it can't get that extra heat, that flowers that grow in the sun like this and that are able to focus in that extra energy produce more seeds, they produce the seeds faster, and the seeds get produced, they're heavier, so they have more resources in each seed. So being able to follow the sun like that can make a really big difference for the success of their progeny coming down the line. And they're beautiful even when they're not in flower. So as those avens or as the dryas goes into flower, the stalk will actually twist up and elevate further, and the flower will turn into this beautiful seed head. And it just, I mean, it's kind of like dandelion fluff if you've ever seen those blowing across the grass, but it's very fluffy, it's very open, and this is a wind dispersed species. So all of these beautiful fluffy bits will catch that, you know, that very strong Arctic or alpine wind and can be blown quite far. So because they are so well distributed by wind, we can actually have fairly high levels of genetic variation even within a small area because there's so much movement through this wind dispersion. Now, another one of my personal favorite, and I hear it from other people as well, favorite alpine and Arctic species are the rhododendrons. And you might be saying, what the heck? Rhododendrons in the Arctic and in the mountains? I've never heard of such a thing. So if you grow rhododendrons in your garden, rhododendrons, as far as most of us think of them, they're fairly large, very showy shrubs. But if you were to come into the northern regions or onto the mountains, you would see some very, very, very small rhododendrons. So the two species that I have up here, the one on the left is called by its common name Alpen Rose, and it is found, as you might expect, in the Alps. It is an alpine species, it's beautiful. And on the right, we have Rosebay, also called Alpine or Arctic Rosebay. They're both in the genus Rhododendron, so they're both rhododendrons. If you look at the flowers, they would look just like the rhododendron flowers that you might have in your garden. But the difference being that the one on the left, the one that you can find in the Alps there, the Alpen Rose, it's a very small shrub. So it might grow up to about 3 feet high. Often it's only about a foot or foot and a half high, much, much smaller than your typical rhododendron. And then the Rosebay on the right, the Rhododendron Lepoticum, actually only grows about 10 or 15 centimeters high. So we're talking 3 or 4 inches. It's like looking at a miniature garden. It's absolutely fantastic. And these are both also species of the fairly early summer. So this might be, you know, late, I was going to say late June. That's not right. That's not early summer, that's still spring. Usually early July, we might see these species coming out. So it's really quite something if you've only ever seen a full-size rhododendron to suddenly see one that's only about the size of your hand for the whole plant. And they're just as beautiful as the full-size ones. Now that one on the right, the Rosebay, can be found in alpine environments as well. The Alpen Rose is only found in the Alps there. Now, this one here that's coming up also looks very small. You can see it's got, just to give you a sense, each of those leaves is about 1/2 inch long or so. So relatively small. This is the mountain cranberry or dry ground cranberry or lingonberry, depending where you are in the world and what common name you're using. Genus species name is Vaccinium Vitisidea. So this is, if you've ever had lingonberry sauce, this is what it comes from. And you can see, again, a lot of those Arctic adaptations, very low growing plants, evergreen leaves, it forms a mat. So it's always trying to control its own environment. It's not losing any dust. It's not losing any nutrients. It's trying to keep that wind down as much as possible. And these are the flowers of the cranberry plants. And they are very, very small flowers. And to be quite honest, for the most part, most of us don't care about the flowers, we care about the berries. And those come along later in the summer. So Ikea lingonberries, it's the exact same thing. So if you've ever purchased or eaten at the Ikea cafeteria and you've eaten lingonberry sauce, it's coming from this plant that can be found everywhere in the circumpolar Arctic as well as through the Alpine regions. And it's important not just for us, not just for the Ikea cafeteria, but it's also a common food of local bird species like grouse or ptarmigan, so even the larger birds will eat it too, as well as the small mammals like voles, lemmings, shrews, whatever it can be found locally. Now, the picture on the right there is the cranberries in the winter, which is actually when, if you were to go out and pick those berries, you would probably want to wait until there was snow on the ground, or at least until there had been a good hard frost. Because when you pick those berries, they start out very, very starchy and bitter. But the moment that they freeze, that starch gets converted to sugar, and they are suddenly quite a bit more palatable to us. Traditionally, in many, many regions, these were a very important source of vitamin C throughout the winter because you can actually go harvest them all the way through the winter if you can manage to find a patch underneath the snow. Now, this is probably the smallest tree you're ever going to walk on. This is the net veined willow, and that orange thing that you can see in the picture is the end of a pen. So it's a very, very small tree. It is a willow. It's a real willow. It occurs in Northern Europe and throughout Northern Scandinavia, the Alps, Arctic Eurasia, throughout North America, and through the mountains here as well. Not within Greenland and Iceland, however. Now it's a really cool dwarf willow. I would say that like the dwarfest of the dwarf willows, it's the smallest it gets, and it grows in a mat along the ground. So it never grows above about 4 inches high or maybe about 10 centimeters high. It's very, very small. You can see the willow catkin, so the flowering spike, or if you've ever seen pussy willows, the same kind of structure growing in the middle there. They are quite hairy, again, to protect from the wind, to encourage it to stay as warm as possible, to make the best use of that sunlight coming in. So keep your eyes open for this one. If you ever see it on the ground, it doesn't look like much, but it is indeed a willow. And if you ever visit somebody who lives in the northern regions or in the mountains, often when we tell somebody to go look in the willows for a bird or an animal, and you're saying, where are the willows? I don't see any willows, because you're used to willows being big, tall, beautiful trees. This is what they can look like, and this is what we're referring to in the northern regions. Now, this next one here, the fireweed, is circumpolar. It's not exclusive to the Arctic or Alpine areas. I actually just passed them on my way in. It's a common species of disturbed areas, and this includes in the Arctic as well. It's very much a pioneer colonizer species, and it tends to move in after fire or after disturbance. It's really beautiful, and it tends to be replaced over time. So if there's been a local fire, for example, fireweed will come in, fill in the area, start to reestablish like a soil and a seed bank for other things, and then 5 to 10 years later, other shrubs will start to take over again as well. You may know it by other common names, including like willow herb or roseberry willow herb. I've also heard bombweed because it can be found in bombed out areas as well. And you can also find a smaller species known as dwarf fireweed in colder or higher elevation areas too. Now, One of the common things that plants run into in the Arctic and Alpine areas is that it is very low in terms of available nutrients, including nitrogen. So we see a lot of flowers like this that belong to the pea family or the legume family because they have a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen fixers. So this is Northern Hedysarum. You can see it's got a similar pea flower to peas that you might have in your gardens. But not every plant takes the same tack to finding its nitrogen. We also have carnivorous plants that live in the Arctic and Alpine as well. So this is a carnivorous plant, and you can see the little tiny corpses of flies that got stuck within the leaves here. So this is the common butterwort. It's got a beautiful purple flower, and it has the sticky mucilaginous substance on its leaves. And insects get attracted to it because it looks like available water, but it's sticky, so it captures the insect. It then releases a bunch of digestive enzymes. The insect gets digested, the nutrients come in through holes in the leaves. The skeleton, like the exoskeleton of the insect, gets left behind. And that is how this plant fertilizes itself. So we see the common butterwort all over the Churchill region, and as well as in higher Arctic and higher Alpine regions as well. In some Alpine regions, we also see the Alpine butterwort, which has a white flower instead, but you can see those leaves that kind of look wet, shiny, curled in, are the same kind of leaves that we saw in the purple or the common butterwort. So you can often find these just on gravel roadsides. They're quite commonly found. Now, one of the main things that faces Arctic and Alpine flowers for a challenge is pollinators. Now, the butterwort might go around deciding it wants to eat its pollinators instead of using them for flowers, but there are actually bumblebees in the Arctic. In Canada, we have 2 species of bumblebees that live above the Arctic Circle, and there are more in high alpine environments. So they're cute, they're fuzzy, they do the same thing bumblebees do anywhere else in the world, but they are not the main pollinator of Arctic and Alpine systems. This next photo I'm going to show up here, it's not to point out the flowers, though they're pretty as well. If you look at the sky here, do you see things that look like that I didn't clean my camera lens? Those are not lens spots, those are a bunch of flying insects. And flying insects are a well-known issue that we deal with in the Arctic, less so in the high altitude areas, but really anywhere we have a lot of standing water, we get black flies, we get mosquitoes. This particular picture was taken north of Churchill. I have had this happen when doing plant surveys, when I've been crawling in and under plants and there's been no wind to push the bugs away. For the record, I have never had this happen on a trip. This is pretty extreme, but to give you an idea what is out there, this is what it can look like. Now, black flies, mosquitoes, the tabanids, which are the big flies like deer flies and the moose flies or the bulldogs, they are actually some of the most important pollinators that we have in the Arctic and Alpine regions. For example, in Churchill, we have 13 species of mosquitoes, 16 species of black flies, 17 species of tabanids, and for all of those, the females feed off the blood meal, but the males actually feed off nectar and pollen. So they are the pollinators of this area. And you can see in this other picture of this is again the Arctic avens, you can see that there is an ant here going in to collect nectar, to collect pollen for food, and is acting as a pollinator at the same time too. So most of those pollinators are not the typical ones that we think of, but they're just as important, if not more so. Now, some of the Arctic and Alpine regions, like we said, they've been changing incredibly since 27,000 years ago when we saw our last glacial maximum. One of the really neat projects that has been producing a lot of interesting data is that some of these historical photo archives are being reshot by current photographers to see how things have changed over the past 100 years or so. So we know that the Arctic and Alpine environments, they're really responsive to temperature changes then. They're really responsive to a lot of stuff. So the species will actually move up or down the mountain as conditions change in the area. So you can see in these shots here from the early 1900s going to close to today, you can see how tree lines move up as we've seen the temperatures increase in the area as well. And just another picture for you there to show you how measurable of a change we've seen even in the last 100 years or so. And one of the important things I always like to do with these webinars is to say, if you're really interested in plants and you find a lot of value in learning about plants and going out and looking at them, there are ways that we can contribute as just people on the ground to important data like this. So if you want to go out and look at plants and you want to turn that plant watching into some real data that can be used on the ground, in Canada, we have an organization called Plant Watch that helps people to track how changes in flowering turn out on the ground. In the US, you've got the National Phenology Network, and they produce great maps like showing you how late spring was this year. So this is, for example, what the National Phenology Network has put out in the US, showing you based on when the first leaves appeared on the ground, how early spring was or how late spring was compared to the last 30 years or so. So some really fun things that we can do just by being on the ground, and it's really helpful to scientists on the ground because as we see changes in when those plants are flowering, we actually see changes in how successful those plants are. So that Arctic avens, the one that I showed you with the great big open white flower, it is the most successful flower. Anything that tries to flower at the same time as the avens will not get pollinators. So one of the studies that we've been seeing happen up north is that we're trying to track when those avens open so we can see what kind of effect it's going to have on other flower species in the area too. So cool stuff. If you like to go out and look at flowers, there's ways of turning that into really useful data as well. So just like to always wrap up with a little action item if you would like to go look at flowers some more. So with that, I'll hand things over to Colby for questions.
Okay, thanks, Eleanor. That was great. It's good little romp around the Northern Hemisphere. We do have some questions, but before we start the Q&A, I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your own questions via the questions field that's located in your control panel. And we have had a number of questions come in today. I think the biggest round of questions I have were actually all about pollination, Eleanor, and you just did a really nice job, I think, of touching on most of that. But some people are also curious about self-pollination up in the Arctic. Can you speak to that for us?
Sure thing. So self-pollination can occur in a number of the flowers, but it's not as common as it is elsewhere. So if you garden, I know, and I'm sure a lot of people do if you're turning into a webinar about wildflowers, we know that species like violets and pansies actually make specialized flowers that self-pollinate. This is not an adaptation that we see in any plants in the Arctic or high alpine regions. So these plants tend to, if they don't get access to pollinators, they either produce a very small number of seeds or they might produce no seeds at all. They're just not adapted for that self-pollination like we see in other areas. That being said, plants like dandelions, plants like sunflowers, they are a little bit more able to self-pollinate, and we do have a native Arctic dandelion. We do have some native Arctic sunflowers, and same thing in the alpine regions as well. They are a little bit more apt to self-pollinate, but as always, kind of no matter what organism you're looking at, anytime they can get outcrosses, the better off the offspring will be. So they're always looking for that outcrossing.
Yeah, very good. And then sticking with pollinators for a second, but moving away from pollination, a few people are asking, about the mosquito season in the Arctic or in the alpine areas. I know you're talking broadly about the whole Northern Hemisphere, but can you speak to that a little bit? Does the mosquito season match the travel season?
So in short, really there's only so much summer to go around. So whether it's flowers, whether it's us, whether it's beluga whales, whether it's the mosquitoes, everybody is getting on the ground at the same time to do its thing. Now, I have spent a lot of time in the Arctic less time in the Alpine, but still some. And what I will say is that, remember those, those climatographs, there's so much wind. In fact, it's one of the main stresses for a lot of the plants is this wind. I have never had so many mosquitoes on me or so many black flies that they detract from my experience of looking at plants or looking at belugas or anything else like that. As long as that really consistent wind is blowing, it really does a great job of keeping those insects down. Are we going to have insects going out there? We will, you know, but we have so many ways of dealing with that, anything from bug nets to bug spray to honestly just making sure that we're in windy open places and we still get a great experience too.
Yeah, that's great. You know, as an EL that guides in Alpine and Arctic environments almost exclusively, I can say even if we're in an area where the mosquitoes or black flies are bad, that doesn't mean we're in it for the entirety of the trip. Right? You might find them somewhere, and then every other place is wonderful to be at. So yeah. I wouldn't let that hinder you from showing up for sure.
No, good point.
Let's see, we have time for time for one more. A few people, I really like these questions. About the relationship to desert plants. I find that very astute. Some people are noticing that the parts of these plants that you're talking about, Eleanor, have commonalities with desert plants. Can you speak to that for us?
Oh, you hit the nail right on the head there for those of you who are noticing that, because like keep in mind, we see a lot of those same stresses, you know, and we're not used to thinking of Arctic and Alpine areas as de facto deserts, but in many areas they really are. And we say sometimes, especially in the Churchill region, which tends to be quite flat and it tends to be like quite wet in a lot of areas. And then you turn around and you see all these plants that are adapted to hold in as much moisture as they can. You have to think, like, what are these plants dealing with right where they are? Because their habitat is only as big as where they are growing. And many of these plants are on rocky soils with no held moisture. They're on possibly good soils, but they're frozen and they can't access that water, or water is only available for 6 weeks out of the year. So all those same adaptations that we see, whether it's deep tap roots to be able to more easily either anchor or access water, to lots of like having hirsute leaves, so hairs on the leaves and lots of moisture control devices, we see those same types of adaptations in these plants as we do in desert environments as well. Some things that we don't see things that are there's some metabolic pathways that work best in high temperature environments. We don't see those here for obvious reasons. So we don't see a lot of those same plants making their way into the Arctic, but in the end, you know, if hairs on your leaves decrease moisture loss, we're probably going to see hairs on leaves anywhere that you have limited moisture.
Okay, very good. Well, that's the last question we have time for today. Eleanor, would you like to say a few closing words here today?
Sure, Colby, thanks. I'd just like to say thanks to everybody for tuning in. It is prime wildflower season now, probably wherever you are in the Northern Hemisphere. So I hope you get out and you enjoy some time with flowers in wherever you are today, because it sure is nice out.
Oh, thank you. We appreciate that sentiment, and thanks for taking the time to present for us today, Eleanor. I'd like to also thank everyone who tuned in today. Join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody.